We should ask Celeste, so you can probably just guess this one. You know that already somewhere. This is not free. We just need a shirtless Putin picture. Maybe him with the chemical warhead dismantled.
All right.
What's up, buddy?
Really? Isn't it crazy?
We have a book that I prepared all the questions today.
Okay.
Are you on top of it? The latest? Yeah, but I mean that you should have
So Celeste, we're gonna get a shirtless picture of Putin dismantling the Syria nerve gas warhead. It'll be airbrushed, don't worry, like all of it. It'll be kind of photoshopped. Maybe there'll be a tiger that makes its way into to really round it out. I believe so. Yeah. Keep at your questions. I was going to focus on the second two for that reason.
Yeah, I'm doing different questions anyway.
Oh, okay.
These aren't going to help you very much. I got to keep you on your toes.
My kids do that pretty good.
Well, I'd like to welcome you all here this afternoon. Thanks so much for coming. What is a momentous time for the country and the world as we try to follow the situation in Syria and the response. I'm Jim Goldgeier, Dean of the School of International Service, and it's just a great pleasure to be here with all of you and with my colleagues here at SIS. We have a very distinguished panel. It's certainly been an interesting several weeks. And I think it's important just to remember the backdrop beyond just the several weeks, and that's a conflict that's been going on for more than 2 years, that's claimed more than 100,000 lives, that's pushed millions of people into refugee camps, and certainly was taken to a new level in late August with the use of chemical weapons. And we've seen the pictures of those who died in that chemical weapons attack. We then had a flurry of activity that seemed like it was going to lead to a U.S. military strike, and then the Saturday of Labor Day weekend, President Obama decided that he would take his case to Congress and seek an authorization to use military force, which he did not have to do based on prior presidential actions, but he had decided that he would do. And he then went to the G20 meetings last week in order to try to generate international support, which proved difficult to do. And then within the last couple of days, and I was checking my my phone just before I sat down to make sure I hadn't missed anything that happened in the last 5 minutes, we've seen a flurry of activity surrounding a Russian-led proposal to put the Syrian chemical weapons stockpile under some kind of international supervision, and that would potentially obviate the need to use military force in order to prevent their use again. The President is making a statement to the country tonight, which was scheduled before all this announcement about the Russian proposal. The President, of course, gave a number of interviews yesterday, is speaking to the country tonight. There's been a lot of activity in the House and Senate, and now discussion about delaying the vote while the United Nations process is worked through. There are a lot of questions still to be answered as to what this process would look like and how it really would be, how it would be implemented, the identification of the Syrian chemical weapons, the ability of the international community to oversee these weapons. I think that as it became clear that the President was going to have a hard time getting an authorization to use force, and as there were discussions about whether he would or wouldn't strike, even if he didn't get an authorization to use force, in many ways this proposal helps him out of a difficult situation this week, but it creates a long-term series of problems that are going to have to be addressed over the coming weeks and months. So we're very fortunate that we have three outstanding experts here with us from SIS to discuss the situation and a variety of different sets of issues. David Bosco is an assistant professor here in the school, an expert on international law in the United Nations, wrote a book on the United Nations Security Council. He writes the Multilateralist blog for Foreign Policy, and he has a book coming out later this fall on the International Criminal Court. Ben Jensen teaches for us in both our U.S. Foreign Policy and Global Governance, Politics, and Security master's programs. He's also been a leading force behind revisions to our undergraduate curriculum, which we're very proud of, that we're implementing this fall. He's played a major role in that in our thematic area in global security and conflict resolution. He also teaches down at Quantico as an officer in the U.S. Army National Guard, and his own work focuses on international security, conflict analysis, and conflict resolution. I'm reading these in alphabetical order, obviously not in the order in which they appear here next to me. Sorry.
Thank God I'm a woman there. You would have gotten really confused about the order. There's always a reason to have a woman on.
They have their names. They have the name things. In the middle is Celeste Wallander, who directs our Global Governance, Politics, and Security program at the master's level, is an expert on Russia and Eurasia more broadly, and served previously in the Obama administration as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. So I'm going to ask a series of questions to get us started, and then we're going to open things up to you to get your questions. And feel free to tweet away. I believe the hashtag is over there. Celeste, I want to start with you. When we look, President Putin's had quite a week. And, I think back to the summer and the run-up to the G20 summit. He was on the defensive for a number of different issues, the crackdown on civil society in Russia, the policies on LGBT issues in Russia that really put him on the defensive, especially in the context of gay athletes going to the Winter Olympics in Sochi, and what the impact of Russian policies would be on those athletes going to Sochi. The Edward Snowden affair. So he seemed on the defensive, and then he had a great G20, and now he seems to be the man of the moment with this proposal that is being touted as providing the opportunity for a diplomatic solution to this crisis. So how do you see his own standing, this particular proposal, and whether or not, as everyone's watching him, whether or not he'll be able to deliver on this proposal in a way that satisfies the broader international community, and particularly the United States?
Great, thank you. Well, I take a slightly different view of Putin's stance of late and the Russian government's stance. I think they are very nervous. And actually, it was interesting, around the time of the G20, the words coming out of Russian spokespersons, Foreign Minister Lavrov, Putin's spokesperson, were very mild, very, sort of course we'll talk to President Obama, of course, and they're trying to dial it back because they're really worried. And the reason they're worried is because the most important instrument of Russian power in something like this is the UN Security Council veto. And President Obama made clear that at some point, if the United States feels that it needs to act, and he decides that the United States needs to act, that's not going to stop him. And so I think what we've seen actually is trying to find other ways to wield power over the U.S. decision. And this proposal, which is a really constructive one, the one that came out of apparently a remark from Senator Kerry that the Russians picked up, that what I want to highlight is the objective of the proposed U.S. action, military action, is to prevent Assad and the Assad regime from using chemical weapons again against their own civilians or against anyone, even against combatants. And there are different ways of achieving that. And if a diplomatic solution could achieve not only preventing the use of chemical weapons against anyone, but also to put those chemical weapons, which earlier President Assad claimed that Syria doesn't have, but that's now not what the Syrian government is saying. They're admitting that they have them. Put them under international control, which would ensure that they wouldn't be used, and which would secure those weapons, which has been a huge concern for the last 2 years, that they would fall into the hands of various terrorist groups, that this would achieve the objective. That's the objective. The objective isn't to overthrow the government. It's not, punishment was a mechanism to achieve the objective, which is to get the regime not to continue to do these things. So if this idea leads to that objective, it's a pretty big success for U.S. security policy. And I would observe two things about it, and then just give the latest from my iPhone, is that it's clear that the willingness of the Russian government and of the Syrian regime to consider this came because of the threat of use of military force. I mean, it's clear. I am not a fan of using military force, but in this circumstance, it was that potential that finally got the Russians to stop simply trying to veto a resolution. Now the latest, though, unfortunately, so everyone's grabbed onto this great idea. Now the problem is that how does this become real? How does it actually get implemented? How do the inspectors get access to everywhere? So there's an implementation issue, and we know that this is really hard to do when it comes to arms control and disarmament. And so the French were proposing to do a UN Security Council resolution, which would express the view of the UN Security Council that the Syrian regime is obligated to undertake these steps, and if it did not, there would be consequences under Chapter 7. Therefore, under Chapter 7, I'll defer to David for all the legal niceties, in principle, use of force would be authorized at that point by the UN Security Council, and now the Russians are refusing. So clearly what this is showing is that the stakes, again, from the Russian point of view, is about preventing anything from happening that the Russian government doesn't want to happen, and preventing the international community from being able to enforce what is now viewed as the best chance for A, stopping the use of chemical weapons, B, securing them, and C, not requiring the United States to use military force. And I think that this latest development is going to actually undermine the achievements that apparently President Putin achieved in sort of getting others to be skeptical of the U.S. view, because here is an opportunity for the international community to get what everyone wants, and they're going to insist on no Chapter 7 enforcement to punch it and make it work.
So thank you. So that, David, that leads nicely into your area of expertise, which is international law. And I wanted to ask you to put this in the broader international law context, because we've seen international law used in very different ways during the last couple of weeks. We have seen President Obama talk about how, you know, this wasn't his red line, this is the international community's red line. The international community has seen these weapons as weapons that should not be used, and the international community needs to stand up and take action when there's been this type of violation, such as this use of chemical weapons. Others are pointing to international law in the context of legitimate use of force only if the United Nations authorizes that use of force. And so we've got this cross-cutting, swirling cross-currents of discussions about international law. And again, now the United Nations is front and center. You blogged this afternoon on the fact that the United Nations was back in the game after being disrespected in recent weeks. So what first can you tell us about sort of how to think about international law in this case, and then your thoughts on whether the United Nations would be able to accomplish what Celeste has said, which would be an enormous victory for everyone in the context of chemical weapons use in this particular case. Again, it doesn't address the broader issue of the Syrian civil war and the problems of a solution to that conflict, but certainly if a chemical weapons stockpile was able to be secured and we could prevent the use of chemical weapons again without having to use force, that would be a major achievement.
Yeah. No, I think you're exactly right that there are competing international norms here. There is the norm embodied in the Chemical Weapons Convention and in a number of other legal instruments against the use of these kind of weapons. But there's nothing in those instruments themselves that authorizes a particular kind of response, and certainly it doesn't authorize the use of military force as a response. So if there is an international community red line on chemical weapons and other kinds of weapons of mass destruction, it is a red line without obvious consequences. And so many of the people skeptical of action, certainly action without Security Council blessing, have been saying, well, what would be the impact here if you were to use military force without the Security Council's approval? You'd be trying to defend one international norm while flouting another international norm, the norm that you only use force other than in self-defense with the explicit approval of the Security Council. So when you get to that point in the debate, you start to reach the question of, well, is one norm more important than the other? Is one norm more established and more worth defending somehow than the other? And I think that is a question that people can disagree about. And there was an op-ed in the New York Times a couple days ago by a couple of Yale law professors saying, by far, according to them, the most important norm is the norm that we don't use force without the Security Council's approval. And I actually think I'm not at all sure that that's the more important norm, nor am I certain that that's much of a norm, actually. But certainly from one view, you can say, yeah, I mean, the more fundamental question is when states are allowed to use military force, not what kind of activity are they allowed to engage in the midst of a conflict. But I think there's something important to recognize here, and there's, all of these crises, they have their own particularities and their own idiosyncrasies, and I think there's always a tendency to kind of assume that every crisis is somehow presenting unprecedented issues. But I think it's important to remind ourselves that what we're seeing here in Syria is a confluence of several different tensions that are very much long-standing in the international community. One is to what degree and when should the international community intervene forcefully in the internal affairs of a state? That is something that has been hashed out repeatedly, and there's still a great deal of disagreement about, when that's appropriate. A second one is when and how aggressively should the international community seek to control weapons of mass destruction. And then a third, and this has received a lot less attention, is how important is accountability in the international system? Accountability for violations of international law, violations like that represented by the chemical weapons attack. One of the, from my standpoint as someone working on the ICC, one of the interesting things is how muted conversation has been about international justice in this case. I mean, you hear the word accountability, and a lot of the rhetoric from the administration and others has talked about the need to have accountability or to there not be impunity. But the mechanisms of international justice at this moment are completely sidelined. There's no discussion of an ad hoc tribunal for Syria. The International Criminal Court is on the sideline because it has no jurisdiction absent a Security Council referral. So I expect, and I think the French resolution contained language requesting an ICC referral. I can't imagine that getting through the Security Council, but I think the French are at least trying to push that back into the mix.
And Ben, it seems that the likely use of force has receded, the likelihood has receded for the moment as we work through this potential United Nations resolution. We had a lot of very interesting discussion in recent days about, very limited military strikes, unbelievably small wars. It was hard to really make sense of a lot of what was being said in the context of what would this accomplish. It was very clear, the President was very clear, as Celeste has said, that his objective, either with military force or now with the resolution, is to ensure that chemical weapons are not used again. One of the questions that arose would a limited strike punish the regime enough in order to, convince it that, doing this again would not be a good idea, even as they went ahead and did other things that they've been doing over the last 2+ years. But we also heard about degrading Assad's military capacity, a lot of discussion about the type of targets that would be hit, the inability to actually, hit the chemical weapons sites because you don't want the dispersal of the of these materials. Can you help us understand if the United States and any of its partners who were willing carried out limited strikes, what would these be, and what could the effect be on the Assad regime and his military capacity?
Sure. Well, first, thank you, Dean. Thank you both for insightful comments, and it's so great to see students interested in talking about these things. I'm going to drop a big nerd bomb first, if I could, and we'll look at the consequences of that. What a fantastic example of why we study international relations. Look at some of the terms that have come across here. A crisis, precedence, great power politics. This is the very substance of why we train ourselves to think creatively and analytically in places like this so we can actually grapple with these questions. So, questions of sovereignty. I mean, this is it, ladies and gentlemen. This is it. This is why this matters. This is why we don't want to get off with just wild punditry. We actually want to go substantively to engage this. So now I'm going to turn my Janus face around as Dr. Evil and talk about the art of destruction. First, I think that this mostly resembles, actually, Desert Fox. Now, a lot of you might not remember it. I know you remember Desert Fox. They might not. But Desert Fox was an operation in the late 1990s where it was about...
They were in preschool, but go ahead.
They were doing their own Desert Fox on the playground, like beating up the lunch money kid. Did punishment work then? Probably not. And it also didn't work in the late 90s. So Desert Fox was the culmination of a series of limited objective raids that were meant to punish Saddam Hussein and actually think about how we go back to the future, enforce some type of international community effort to kind of police Iraq. It was, I believe it was Madeleine Albright at the time, I can't remember, that said it was degrading but not eliminating. There was a very specific term used that sounds familiar. Now let's talk in modern context what degrading but not eliminating mean, because ladies and gentlemen, these terms mean people die. Number one, we have approximately 4 to 5 destroyers in the eastern Mediterranean and 2 aircraft carriers off the coasts. Mostly this looks like, unlike the late 90s, they don't necessarily have to rely on air power alone, so pilots and aircraft, but you would probably launch a series of what are called TLAMs, Tomahawk Land Attack Munitions. These are missiles that will come out. They come out of a sub. They can come out of a ship that will fly a low profile and actively be able to seek a target. Now, the benefit here, if you're an American sailor, is that limited risk to you because you have a high standoff range. The problem, though, is that they have once the target locks in at a certain point, you can't reprogram it. So the problem with this is that you're going to have to, you can't dynamically retarget the way you can an aircraft. So this means as you begin to campaign plan, you're looking for things that cannot move in about a 30 to 40 minute window. Well, most of the stuff we're talking about hitting, because we can't hit the facilities, can move in that time frame. So you have your first major operational challenge. So you're going to have to fire repeatedly, and this is, read your Graham Allison, read his Model 2, and you start to see how target sets proliferate. How even when the president might ask directly to the national security staff for a limited strike target package, the military is going to come back and say, well, sir, I'm sorry. We can hit these targets, but if you really want to increase your probability of destroying them, we've got to hit these, we've got to go it. So what would you degrade? The first thing we've heard is focus on the delivery system. So we can take out rockets, we can take out Scuds. Big problem, ladies and gentlemen, he's got a massive stockpile and he can deliver it by artillery. There's a lot of artillery tubes, and that you can literally put that to the back of a truck and drive it around. So now you're talking about putting aircraft in the air, stealth bombers or possibly other aircraft, fifth-generation fighters on a CAS mission, close air support, that can be able to loiter long enough for intelligence to cue it. Well, that means you proliferate now to have to take out an integrated air defense system. So the real risk we run in Syria, even if we're just degrading and eliminating, is that that target set could proliferate wildly beyond that, even as the mission is going on. So we might imagine 2 days, 43 targets, I heard, but I would caution you to watch that carefully, because it could easily expand beyond that. And when it expands beyond that, that's where we get to consequences. Now, this is something for you to think about, too. How do we even answer those questions? Do we extrapolate? Do we use historical precedent, certain cases to imagine? How do we forecast? How do we see through the fog and friction of war to imagine what this might even look like? I see some smiles because we talked about Clausewitz and Sun Tzu last night, so I'm going to drop a little Sun Tzu for you. Wait for it. It will come. So I think the big thing here is let's walk through some consequences. I'm going to take a little bit of a different view. There is no good win set here for the United States. This is better. This is the bargaining theory of war. This is a little better than some of the other alternatives, but unfortunately it's better than bad, and better than bad is not good. So let's start with what might happen. Well, let's say you're degrade but not eliminate, and you actually find that you hit the targets you want. There's no regime change. You've punished. You've sent your message. Well, the next question is what happens next? You're right. You meet the immediate policy objective. Maybe there's no further use of chemical weapons for a month, 2 months, 6 months. The problem is Assad has been able to effectively fight a stalemate largely with conventional forces. And it's nowhere clear that this chemical attack, which the real interesting question is why now, made any significant difference in the nature of the fight going on. This is a regime that is willing to attack bread lines. Right? Let's be clear about what we're talking about here. So the idea that this is some type of escalation for them, it's an escalation more for us, but the question is, why now and what happens afterwards? I'm not sure that if you degrade but don't eliminate, it changes much in the way of his game plan. I think you have a short-term window because Assad will hide stuff right now, but the second he feels no more pressure, he pulls it back. In fact, I'd be willing to bet that while this diplomatic push is going on, there's probably 3 of the Syrian crack divisions have orders to hit as much as they can in this short time window. A pattern we saw in the Balkans occasionally, too. Like right at certain moments of negotiation, you think you have leverage to go attack. And I wouldn't be surprised if that's happening right now. Now, the other element of this is, does that strike increase U.S. credibility? Because let's go to that level of great power politics. If he still lives to fight, no. In fact, you almost look worse in terms of your credibility than if you did nothing. Because now you're in a situation, let's even take this from a standard kind of signaling type calculation. The strength of your signal is a function of your capabilities, what can you do, and your credibility. Do people believe that you will actually do it? Your credibility becomes really questionable here. And in all of our, people slinging ideas at each other on cable news, we can convince ourselves that it's a glowing success, but there's going to be some very different conversations in small rooms inside many national capitals about what can we count on, what can't we count on. Now, along those lines, too, the other one. Oh,
You want one more quick
sure.
point?
Yes. Well, oh, that's it. The last point I'd say, catastrophic success, soft decapitation, you get lucky. What if you actually hit something you didn't mean to, a command and control facility where there's some type of meeting? Is that a success? The rebels start to take advantage of this. The problem is sudden regime collapse is not a pretty thing. You almost move from ethnic cleansing that looks like Bosnia to something in the short form that looks more like Rwanda. And I'm not so sure that's actually the place we want to end up to. So I like to seek the good in things. I'm having trouble here, Dean.
Mm-hmm. So I want to come back. Thank you all three for getting us started. I want to come back to Celeste and David on the UN question. Ben was just talking about credibility. David, how much is the UN's credibility on the line here for being able to do something? The timing is interesting from a UN perspective because you've got the UN General Assembly meetings coming up. So what does it mean for Ban Ki-moon? What does it mean for the UN in general? And then back to Celeste's point about, you know, the Russian role in the world is greatly strengthened by having the permanent status on the UN Security Council, the veto power on the UN Security Council. So it's clearly going to be very important for Russia to make this succeed through the United Nations. What can they do in order to help strengthen that UN process? If we could start with David on the UN's credibility here.
Yeah, I mean that's a really hard thing to assess, and it's always discussed in these types of situations. I mean, Ban Ki-moon has come out with statements, you know, saying that the use of force without council authorization would be illegal and would be undermining of the institution. So, you know, certainly I think the Ban Ki-moon and others see this as quite. He's also, of course, criticized the Security Council for its paralysis, and so he's suggested that the credibility of the institution is at stake. I'm rather doubtful of those kind of claims. I mean, I think the UN's credibility goes up and down, and it depends very much on the context whether it's going to have credibility. You know, there was a lot of talk after Kosovo in 1999, after Iraq in 2003, that the UN's credibility had somehow been fatally damaged because the institution was bypassed. And yet, you saw the institution kind of bounce right back and become, you know, I think after the Iraq in 2003, the Security Council passed more resolutions in the next couple of years than it had passed previously. So I tend to have a very pragmatic view of the UN, which is that it's a diplomatic instrument, it's a tool. It's going to be useful in some contexts, not useful in others. I do not buy into the rhetoric that somehow if the U.S. goes around the Council here, that's going to substantially damage the institution. I think the institution will be back. It'll be relevant in some other crisis. So I tend to be quite skeptical of the idea that there's somehow these fissures or there's corrosive effect on the institution that, you know, leads it down the path toward marginalization. So that leads me to think that neither bypassing the UN nor the UN's inability to respond to this necessarily means that the institution is fatally flawed in dealing with some other situation. It means that the relevance of the institution depends highly on the context.
And Celeste, in terms of the Russia's ability, we saw again quite a diplomatic performance last week with the G20, and you know, the Russians seem to be doing quite well with major players in the international community.
Well, I think I'm going to link this to the points David just made about the more fundamental questions of the UN and the UN Security Council. And I've worked a lot on security cooperation in international institutions, and you know, the fundamental reason why there is political and also intellectual support for international law, for working on security issues through international institutions, is exactly the idea that international institutions facilitate solutions where states do not unilaterally and selfishly pursue their own narrow self-interests, and especially through the exercise of national power. That's the idea. International institutions are supposed to enable cooperation. The problem with the UN Security Council right now is because of the veto powers, which is a vestige of the last century, which everyone agrees doesn't make any sense whatsoever, is that the UN Security Council has now become the institution for enforcing the power of the great powers and allowing them to selfishly pursue their narrow self-interest over multilateral solutions to security challenges. And that's what Russia and China are doing. The United States does it too. We can talk about other cases. But in this instance, that's what, when the calls for you have to have a UN Security Council resolution enabling the use of force, is actually reinforcing great power politics and the pursuit of narrow self-interest rather than seeking compromise and cooperation and security solutions. And that's why everyone was so hopeful at this proposal for an idea for getting international institutions right, putting it back on track, being part of the solution, not part of the paralysis. And why it's so disappointing to see, given that opportunity, that it appears, I mean, this is all a game and, negotiations, and there's probably many, steps still to play, but the statements at least I saw from the Russian government today about not allowing the UN Security Council, which is supposed to be the locus for the broader good, and you have an opportunity for that, not letting it do its job. And so unless Russia finds a way, unless the Russian leadership finds a way to stop insisting, and it doesn't mean it has to agree with the United States. This is not about, cooperation consists of doing whatever we want. That's not cooperation. But unless the Russian leadership finds some way to step beyond its own narrow self-interest and think about the broader security issues at stake in Syria, I don't really see the solution to the question you posed.
And I'm going to open it up in a minute because we have so many people here, and I think, are we able to get questions from people who are watching it online? Is that, yeah, you got, okay. I just want to make a comment about the challenge for President Obama, the challenge that's existed over the last couple of weeks, which is that in order to, and it builds off a point you were just making, in order to generate strong international community support, he has to put this conflict and this particular use of chemical weapons in the context of an international community that should want to do something about the use of chemical weapons, and that this is an international norm that needs to be upheld. If he wants the American public to support it, he's going to have to talk about American national interest. And I think one of the reasons why you've seen so much public opinion against using force, is not just war weariness because of Iraq and Afghanistan, skepticism about the role that military force can play in changing a situation like this one, but also, that the American public is looking out there and saying, well, if this is a problem for the international community, why does everybody always come to us to do something about it? And that's why the case would really have to be made. And President Obama has been doing this, I think, more in the last couple of days than he was last week at the G20, but tying the upholding of the norm to an American national interest. But it's a very nuanced argument to make, and it just shows you the different constituencies that he's addressing, because he's addressing an international community and is, of course, also addressing the domestic audience.
Jim, can I come in with one quick point? I think it's also important to keep in mind, at least in terms of Security Council dynamics, that Libya is fresh in people's minds on the Security Council. Yes. And the perception among non-Western folks on the Security Council was that Security Council authority was abused by NATO, in that there was the authorization of force to protect civilians. Very quickly it became a regime change operation, effectively. And so I think that is playing very much into the dynamics up in New York.
Yes, absolutely. So let's open it up. So if you have a question, if you could say who you are, and if you the briefer, more succinct the questions are, the more we will be able to get in the time that we have available. There's a gentleman in the back, and then we'll come up front.
Yes, my name's Henry Carmichael, and I'd say one of the biggest questions I have
are you
about
here in SIS? Are you?
I am political science. I'm taking UC World Politics, and I wanted to ask about what Mr. Bosco was saying about Libya. Yeah, I followed the Libyan revolution very closely when it occurred 2 years ago, and one of my biggest questions in this situation is how different is the Syrian revolution from the Libyan revolution? You have a country where this ruler has taken extreme action against his own people. There is 100,000 people dead in Syria. There are millions of refugees. Half the country is in despair, and it's harming our allies around Syria, which is, from my perspective, almost very similar to what occurred in Libya. And I don't understand why the United States isn't seeing the necessity to act in Syria as it saw the necessity to act in Libya.
You want to take that, and then if you have any...
Well, I think it's very hard to argue that on a humanitarian level, Syria is anything but more serious than Libya. I mean, there was the fear in Libya that there were going to be wholesale massacres in Benghazi if Gaddafi were to have defeated the rebels. But certainly if you look at the numbers of dead, Syria dwarfs Libya. So I think from a straight-up humanitarian perspective, Syria is much more serious and much more deserving of international intervention from that standpoint. But obviously, the political dynamics matter. And the political dynamics in Libya were that because of a variety of factors, including Gaddafi's international isolation, Russia and China on the Security Council were willing to acquiesce to measures in a way that they're not on Syria. Ben, I think, could tell us more about the military differences. There's significantly different military capabilities between Syria and Libya. So I think the differences that you're looking for between Libya and Syria are not about the humanitarian situation. They're about the broader political and strategic situation.
It's not just the military one, because I mean, on paper, Syria can hurt you, Libya cannot. The bigger problem is the great power political agenda here, right? Syria is de facto a regional war. This is not just a civil war. This is a regional war. And on one side, you have Iran, and you have Syria, and you increasingly have elements inside Iraq to include elements inside the government. On the other side, you have a range of Gulf states. You have Turkey. You have the Friends of Syria group. So to intervene would not just be to intervene alone on a humanitarian grounds. That calculation is one, but it's how it tips the scale in that regional balance, in that regional civil war, in a way that could have unintended consequences in terms of how it unsettles the whole region. I mean, there's a delicate deterrent web in this region that's already barely holding on.
Right. Well, okay, I got it. I want to repeat it because people online, since you don't have the mic now, won't hear it. So I mean, the question is, we're already supplying the rebels, the opposition. Why not go farther to do more?
Just real quickly, so we can get to the other questions.
Yep.
I mean, when we say supplying rebels, we have to put this into perspective. The kind of group in the U.S. military that does this are especially Green Berets and the Special Forces, and they're designed to train small-size units that do raiding missions, right? Because this is really weird path dependencies back to kind of training insurgencies and counterinsurgencies during the Cold War. They're not equipped to stand up entire regiments or to train people to fly planes in Jordan who will then start to bomb. And yet the Syrian military is conventional enough. Just giving people sniper rifles, training them to commit those ambushes is just not going to be enough to take down the Assad regime. So it's just qualitatively different.
Right. I also, there are a lot of differences between the two cases. In the Libya case, you had Arab League support. You had, in fact, had a couple Arab countries that were participating in the military effort. All that was made easier because Gaddafi had no friends, and because of the Arab support, it made it harder for the Russians to oppose doing something because they didn't want to jeopardize their own relationships across the Arab world. And so, as David said, they were willing to go along with an initial authorization that then became something much larger. You also had the British and French being able to be out in front. In this case, you know, you have the British Prime Minister stymied by the British parliamentary vote. So there really are a lot of differences in this case, and in many ways there were things that facilitated the operation in Libya, even though in that case President Obama was quite reluctant for some time to get involved there as well.
Hi, my name is Priyanka Srinivasa. I'm a senior in SIS, and I'm double majoring in anthropology as well. So thank you so much for having this wonderful and enlightening panel. I had a question that relates more to the anthropology side and a little bit more about, I mean, Dr. Jensen, you talked a little bit about who these targets are and that there will be damage. So I'm curious as to, I mean, obviously Syria is not a monolith, and there are there's socioeconomic, different classes, different religions. So who exactly wants us to intervene? Who are the Syrians that are getting involved? Because when I was in Egypt a couple months ago and meeting with Syrian refugees, I mean, they really didn't want, they were just tired. So who are these people that we're talking about? Who are we helping, and what is their true agenda? So that's pretty
Great.
much my question.
That was a great question.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes, please.
I'm not sure that I know, and I think your suspicion is well-founded. And I think that's part of not war weariness, but we're stuck in the narrative of these last decade of war that we become very weary of, local experts who come to America, claiming to understand exactly what should be done and how it should be done. Yeah, we have one of those in Afghanistan that's not working so well. We've had a lot of those run through Iraq, and it didn't work so well. So I think your suspicion is well-founded. But the problem becomes is, what do you... The fundamental question of data and uncertainty here. If you're a national decision maker, what do you base that data on? How reliable is any of that information because of the fog and friction of war? It's almost existential uncertainty. It's Hobbes's anarchy in its true form. You don't even know. You sleep with one eye open. What do you trust? So,
yeah, and I just, Ben knows better than anyone in Afghanistan, having been deployed there. But in many of these cases, when you have different forces within a society fighting one another, the reason for wanting the U.S. to intervene is not because they are friendly to the United States or care about the United States. It's, can something the United States does enable them to do better in the conflict that they're in? And certainly we've seen in Afghanistan the way in which we have been used by different groups within that country that had their own agenda. And of course, there are many different forces within Syria, some that we call moderate and hope would at least be amenable to good relationship with the United States and the West in general, and others that are much more radical and might benefit from activity, which is of course one of the fears that many members of Congress have raised, but are not in any way would not in any way be grateful to the United States if the United States were able to do something that improved their situation.
Just quickly too, and link it back to the Libya question. And I just, if you guys didn't leave with anything else, I would feel successful. If you didn't leave with anything else, it would be this: you have to distinguish between intervening in the civil war, regional war, whatever it is, war, and what is the issue before us right now, which is the limited use of force to deal with the chemical weapons use. The decision before the president has already made a decision that the United States will not do the former, and he's been criticized for that, and many in this room may criticize him for that and think that's wrong. But we're not talking about intervening on the part of one group or another, in part because of the very dynamics you raised, which is the decision is we can't micromanage this. There are groups that we don't want to see win. We don't want another use of American force in an Islamic country where we'll be blamed, rightly, because if you kill people, you get blamed for those deaths. And that's been the challenge for the last 2 years, and exactly why President Obama has not been willing to intervene. And so sometimes no one did this here, but you hear this, oh, it's going to be Iraq all over again. Iraq was different. The president wanted to intervene. The president wanted to overthrow the regime. This president, rightly or wrongly, and you may as citizens of the United States or of the world think he's making a mistake, but the issue isn't taking sides. The issue isn't trying to overthrow the government. The issue before us is how do you deal with the Assad regime's use of chemical weapons?
But just one point on that, if I could. I think it's fine to say that, but you have to acknowledge that there is something morally bizarre about saying this is over the line, but killing 100,000 people is not. And that is one reason I think that the administration has had a hard time here making the case to the American public, because you can talk about the norm of chemical weapons, but it's just strange to people to say that somehow we're going to intervene because this weapon was used, but we're not going to intervene on the basis of executions and rapes and other things that have been going on. And we intervened in Libya on the basis of atrocities that were not involving chemical weapons. So I think, you know, I take your point, but you've also got to acknowledge, I think, the weirdness of it, fundamentally.
Well, and I also want to, I just want to add a point which Ben may want to weigh in on. You know, I think that President and others have been very clear that they don't believe there's a military solution to the conflict in Syria. We don't even know if there would be a political solution to the conflict in Syria, right? We don't know if there's any solution to the conflict in Syria. A political solution to the conflict in Syria, if it were achievable, would have to involve people wanting to come to the table to negotiate a solution. And, you know, there's been no reason in recent months for President Assad to feel he had any need to come to a negotiated solution, as he was, given the performance of his forces within this civil war. So I think one of the big questions that people have been asking about this, the limited strike, is if you've left the situation the same as it was before, taking out the future use of chemical weapons, but you weren't using enough coercive pressure in order to bring President Assad to a negotiating table, then you haven't fundamentally changed the situation. And I don't know whether you feel like the strikes that are being talked about would have that kind of coercive power. Celeste made the point that the threat of those strikes had the coercive power to get this proposal in front of everybody and to get the Syrians talking about putting a stockpile that they did not have previously on the table for international supervision. But it would take a lot more than that to get him to want to negotiate a solution.
Well, first, I mean, this is such a great case, we hopefully are realizing, for constructivism in war. Going to war for a norm, the language game of is it war, isn't it war, it's fascinating. And I'm sorry, you start blowing things up in someone's country, you can call it chess, you can call it a happy trip to a picnic. People are dying, it's war, period. And you don't go half to war. You don't get half pregnant. You're either all in or all out because you cannot control the consequence. I can't take credit. That's Anthony Zinni. General Zinni said that, and there's something to it, because you cannot control the forces that will be unleashed when this happens, the manipulation. So, also too, to take it back to a rational standpoint, most studies say that punishment doesn't work. Coercion. So Robert Pape's work on bombing to win. Air power as a coercive tool can work to the extent that you take a denial strategy. So in this case, you have to attack something of value that Assad values enough that he would back down. And I'm not sure a 2 to 3 day operation that's hitting scattered platforms would do that. You'd have to up the ante and hit something that really risks retaliation, and that the delicate balance of terror, we used to call it, breaks down in the Middle East writ large.
One thing about chemical weapons, it took Assad 2.5 years to kill 100,000 people. It took a couple of weapons to kill 1,400 people. That's why we call them weapons of mass destruction. And the prohibition on the use of biological and chemical weapons, especially in the Middle East, if it's enforced and if it's observed, it's going to save a lot of lives over the next few years, because a lot of countries in the region have these weapons. And there are a lot of dictatorships who will do anything to stay in power, as we're seeing. So I think the prohibition matters, not because it's better to die when you're shot in the head with a bullet, but because these guys can kill a lot of people if they start using these weapons. And those are the stakes, I think, that we need to focus on.
We could keep going on this one for the rest of the time. Stephanie, I wanted to see whether anybody watching online had a question to ask.
We do. We have a question
And
online.
who's telling us this question?
This is from... Oh,
Yeah, and then them as well.
I'm Lindsay Joy. I'm an SIS alum.
Great. Welcome back.
Thank you. And we have a question off of Twitter from S. Al-Wahabi. He is posing, how would the panel evaluate Saudi Arabia's role in the issue? And is it possible to consider military intervention with help of the Arabs and Turkey?
Right, and so this references when President Obama was at the G20 last week, and the countries that were supportive of him doing something forceful. There was a broader group that was willing to sign on to a broader statement, but Canada, France, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia were the countries that were most in line with the type of argument that President Obama would be making, and what role that plays in this. You were raising this a little while ago.
It's my understanding, if you look at the structure of the Friends of Syria group, and what I understand about it is Saudi Arabia and Turkey are both arming and training rebel factions. Another consequence that could get really weird is, let's say we do a limited raid. What if someone exploits the mess? Turkey has been trying to advocate for a humanitarian corridor for some time now, some type of buffer space where they can both relieve the refugee pressure that they're having, but then also kind of create safe havens that they could possibly arm those groups and go further in Syria. So I think it's a good question to ask, if there's even that limited strike, who else benefits and how do they exploit it? Now obviously Turkey's a member of NATO. We would closely coordinate. We have good relationships, so it's probably unlikely they would surprise us like that. But the longer we go into a crisis, the more rational calculation will break down.
And it's important always to recognize a regime like Saudi Arabia. I mean, the thing that type of regime fears the most is Islamic radicals that want to undermine their regime. So you see them supporting forces in the region that they feel are anti-radical Islamic extremists, and in a sense, we see this in Egypt with support for the Egyptian military supporting what they would consider to be a status quo and trying to keep the lid on Islamic extremism. Can we go over here and see? Yeah, why don't we take both questions that you guys have? We'll just take them both, and then the panel will respond to those.
Hi, my name's Kasia. I'm a first-year grad student in SIS. My question is kind of related to the conversation you guys were having earlier about whether or not to the chemical weapons red line, like you can't get half pregnant, as Professor Jensen was saying. The point that I've kind of been thinking over my head is, how are we supposed to go and send in special forces of some sort and then leave? I feel like there's a certain level of responsibility that comes with us doing anything in Syria. So are we going to go in, do a little something, exit, and then if and when Bashar leaves, what's going to happen to that power vacuum that exists that we in essence helped create with our intervention? What will happen in that situation? Because then there's nothing that we can do, because we chose to go in a little bit, but we also created a dynamic that's now going to hurt our allies in Turkey and in fledgling countries like Iraq.
And then, please. Yep, absolutely. We're going to walk and chew gum at the same time up here. Yeah.
Hey, my name is Tony Gregg. I'm also a first-year SIS student in the Ethics, Peace, and Global Affairs program. And this is kind of a civil-military question. Dr. Jensen, as you phrased, or as you seem to come to the conclusion, this limited strike is probably going to be limited if not successful, which I think is what a lot of the senior military leaders have advised the president as well. And yet he still wants to take that strike. And then, I apologize, it's Dr. Wallander, is that right? As you've put it, defending this norm is very important, but a limited strike that's going to miss most of these weapons or not hit these weapons isn't going to seem to achieve that end either. So what is it that the president, what is he really defending here by launching this strike?
None of us know what the targets are. It's classified. It might be changing day to day as Assad moves things around. targets don't have to be the chemical weapons. They can be all different kinds of things. If you're trying to send a message, not do it again, you can target all different kinds of things, including things that don't move. None of us know. It's interesting it's a great discussion. Everyone's thinking about these things, getting interested, hopefully taking Professor Jensen's classes on these things later to learn more about it. But, you know, at some point, you know, we should have these conversations to think them through. Yeah. But we don't know what actually will be targeted. And there's been a lot of focus and attention on Syria. There's probably a rich target set. That doesn't make it easy, and it's not going to be forces on the ground, special forces. It's going to be some kind of standoff forces, which has an effectiveness problem, as Ben pointed out. So, you know, hopefully we won't get there. Hopefully the French will brilliantly come up with a different version of their UN Security Council resolution, and we'll get an international solution to get control of these weapons and get them under international monitoring.
I want to just add on to Kafia's point about you know, sort of our own responsibility were we to start an action, you know, in a very different context. Former Secretary of State Colin Powell, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, you know, used to have his Pottery Barn argument. You know, you break it, you fix it, and you know, you can't just walk in a store and do damage and then leave. But I also want to add to that because we've had a lot of debate regarding the unmanned aerial vehicles, the drones. We go after specific targets. We often end up having civilian casualties in those instances. We're talking in this case as though we could hit these military targets without having civilian casualties. How does that affect what our responsibility would be if we were to engage in this type of action?
I mean, again, not to tout what we do here, but these great questions of ethics, responsibility, bringing things in, like going back and reading our Kant, what does it mean to be your own moral agent? I mean, this is fantastic stuff. And you're right, there needs to be that dialogue between civilian officials and military leaders that have that productive relationship, and I'm sure there is, and there should be dissension, and dissension is actually a positive thing.
Right, we have it here on the panel.
Yeah.
So, yes,
but
there you go.
Where you quickly run into is I tend to side with, you're right, you break it, you own it, and I like my class.
Right, you break it, you own it, right. You don't fix it, right. He doesn't bring the glue in. Yeah, right.
Unfortunately. But what we have to look here is that you're right, we don't know target sets. Let's start to get creative, though. We haven't even talked about what a kind of coercive cyber campaign would look like. I could imagine if a bunch of senior Alouette officials woke and looked up at their phone and saw text messages that said you have $0 in your bank account, we could have some very different conversations. But that gets to great legal questions about can we even do that? But
not can we do it, may we do it.
May we do it. We can't. That's true. Better check your phone right now.
Can I come in with one quick point on this question about afterward and the Pottery Barn rule? I mean, Libya shows us that you can break it and not fix it and not own it.
Yeah. Right.
So, you know, the United States broke the Gaddafi regime. The West broke Gaddafi regime and didn't do much afterwards. And Libya is more or less in a state of chaos now. And so you certainly can do that. The question is whether you should do it. But about this long-term Syria political question, I am far from being a Syria expert, but I do think there's a lot of talk about who are we helping here? Who are these people? What are they like? You know, are they extremists? I think there's a more simple question. And to me that is that the Assad regime is a minority regime ruling a country that it can only rule that country by force, in essence. And if the Assad regime were to fall, presumably it would be replaced by a regime that had greater support from the Syrian people as a whole. Now, it might be a despotic regime, it might be horribly corrupt, it might be ineffective, it might be extremist, but it would be representing in some sense the bulk of the country in a way that the Assad regime cannot. I think that's actually an important distinction. And to my mind, that was the distinction in Kosovo, was between a 10% ruling a 90% or whether the 90% were going to rule. Now, as we've seen in Kosovo, the way they've ruled has been fairly unfortunate. Still, to my mind, a better outcome that the 10% aren't ruling the 90%.
Can we go? We have another online question.
Uh-oh, they already cyber attacked us.
One question would be, how do we know this isn't just another delay tactic from Russia?
Yeah. We don't?
Well, that's why the French are seeking the Security Council resolution for exactly that reason, to have, you know, an agreed upon set of procedures, benchmarks, verification mechanisms, and then consequences if it doesn't go forward. That's exactly why. I think that I don't want to. However, that said, so I think you're picking up on. I'm kind of tough on this. Nonetheless, delay is not necessarily a terrible thing. If, and not everyone in this room agrees with me, if the main objective is preventing another use of chemical weapons. You know, people were warning, well, if there's a delay, then Assad will disperse these things and put them in bunkers. Bunkers is better than on artillery, rockets, you know, being launched at people. So if delay, as long as delay involves attention, focus, continued understanding and firmness on the objective, it wouldn't be a terrible thing for a while. And I think that was reflected in what President Obama said when he said he's willing to consider this proposal, that kind of delay could be managed and wouldn't necessarily be negative, but it still would require keeping the focus on this issue.
I think, you know, the delay, though, it creates all sorts of difficult issues, because if it seems like you're making progress, you don't want to do anything that people would then say you disrupted the progress that was being made. On the other hand, you know, this could get dragged out for some time, and then you'd be in a difficult situation. That's why there are a lot of people still arguing you still want to get the Congress, if they were so inclined, to authorize the use of military force, to do that in order to even if you change the resolution now to take account of what's taking place, that you would still have that. And I think it's also important to recognize, you know, when you talk about the Russians and think about their own interests in this particular situation, you know, Celeste has very articulately outlined the rationale that President Obama has used and his primary interest in preventing the use of these weapons again. You know, the Russians want, above all, not to see the United States use military force in Syria or really in most other places. They're very unhappy over the last 2 decades with the way in which the United States has been able to act in a number of different instances and use military force. David's already mentioned how angry they were that a limited, what they saw as a limited UN Security Council authorization in Libya turned out to be regime change. And this is something that they are very concerned about in general, and they have been very focused on this in the Syria case. And so I think it's important, you know, it doesn't mean that, again, you know, the interests, even if they're different, could still drive you to the same outcome, because an outcome in which the United States is satisfied with what's happened with the chemical weapons stocks and led to the United States and allies not using military force would be a good outcome from the Russian perspective. Yes, please. Can you wait for the mic?
I apologize. My name is Emmanuel. I am from Venezuela. I'm an abroad at AU student.
Great.
And
Welcome.
I am here. Thank you. I am here taking courses in the SPA and SIS. So my question is directed to the diplomatic track, to see in terms of a probable transition in the future and a regime change, whether or not is it orchestrated by the West or not, and taking into consideration the previous Russian reluctance to accept and to adopt the communique that was issued in the Geneva conference last year, what is the actual prospects, or what are, the actual prospects for the U.S. foreign policy in terms of a possible second Geneva conference where these same issues are probably going to be picked up again, and that could lead to, of course, a continued and long-lasting protractedness in the ongoing hostilities? Thank you.
David, do you want to handle that?
Well, just I guess I'd just say that when you're talking about the diplomatic track, and I assume you're talking here about negotiations between the Assad regime and rebel forces, I think the military balance is what is decisive in terms of whether those are going to proceed or have any meaning. Because right now, as I understand the military balance, the Assad regime is essentially prevailing. And so long as they're prevailing, they have no reason to enter into they may enter for cosmetic reasons into negotiations, but they have no reason to enter into serious negotiations about power sharing. And so, you know, I think if you were to have an intervention that was actually aimed at tipping the balance, as you had in the Balkans, where a combination of Croatian ground offensive and NATO military strikes really changed the military situation for the Bosnian Serbs, that forced them to the negotiating table in a serious way. If you were to have an intervention like that, I could imagine a diplomatic conference having some meaning, but I don't imagine these kind of strikes having any real impact in terms of that, because they're not designed to change the military balance.
Yeah. One of the other experts we have in the room is Professor Mike Schroeder, who is an expert, also an expert on the United Nations Security Council, the UN role in peacekeeping operations. So,
yeah, I just want to quickly sort of follow up, David, with that last point you made, because I think the question's a really good one. If they can get an agreement on securing and destroying the chemical weapons stockpile, number one, would that require likely a ceasefire, in which case that might change the balance of the negotiating table? Maybe you don't, but it would strike me that at the very least the Russians would have to put some pressure on the Assad regime to stop shelling at least key parts of the country. And number two, could a secure and destroy mission would the United States have to put troops on the ground for that, or can we really leave it to other countries, at least on the secure side of it, especially if there is no ceasefire?
Yeah, so let me just add to that as a question. You know, somebody has to go in and secure these sites, right, in the middle of a conflict in which a lot of people are dying. So it doesn't seem like it's the kind of thing that people would be rushing to sign up to do.
You get Fiji.
So how does that work? Well, how does it work? I mean, Mike has there's a great point, right?
I mean, I'd let David speak to the idea of who would be involved. It's a horrible mission. There is no one will volunteer. And can you imagine the backlash domestically if somehow this becomes a pretext for putting U.S. forces in? I just don't see in any of these conversations, everyone agrees that's a non-starter. So, and my fear about this, the Bosnia model is, do we want an Alawite Republic Srpska? Because that'll look a lot different than Europe.
I mean, there's two issues here. This is good question. There's two issues. One is, could you do it where there's active fighting, in regions where there's active fighting? And second, how would you do it? So you probably couldn't do it if there was active fighting. So this all presumes that, I mean, this is the point. It presumes that the Russians get the Syrians to agree and actually do it. And then it would be incumbent upon Turkey and Saudi Arabia and possibly the United States to get the non-government groups that are fighting to cease as well. And so that would be hard, but that's what you'd have to do. In terms of who would go in and do it, there are actually experts, there are UN experts that are trained, and they do this all the time. And it probably wouldn't be the United States, because we tend not to invest in those kinds of capabilities, but there are a lot of countries that contribute experts who do this sort of thing all the time, and have experience. David knows better than I, but so the bigger challenge is, getting the agreement and getting an agreement that is actually implementable. But the rest of it seems to me, you could do. And would these inspectors and verifiers be in danger? Yes, but they know that. When they sign on, these aren't cowardly people. These are very brave people.
Yeah, I totally agree that it is a feasible mission. Now, you'd always have questions about, particularly with chemical weapons, you'd have a lot of questions about, was there some secret stash put somewhere for, a rainy day? I don't think you'd ever have kind of certainty that you've gotten them all, but certainly you could get a lot of them, and I think Celeste is exactly right that there are people trained to do this, and I think you would find people willing to do it. So I think that's not the obstacle.
We have time for one more question. Why don't, since you're standing right next to the microphone, please.
I'm sorry, I missed a good portion of this conversation, so if this was ever discussed, I'm sorry for being redundant. My name is Tanaya, and I'm a second-year undergraduate student in SIS, and my question for you is, if this is like in the future, there's been a lot of talk about international norms and the setting of precedent within the debate about the usage of chemical weapons. And my question for you is, if Bashar al-Assad was ever captured, or if Syria ends up in a situation in which Assad is deposed and there's a call for justice and there's corroboration that the Assad regime did use chemical weapons, or, how would a trial, what bodies would try him, and how would that look? Because there are some cases in which the Assad regime obviously, like I'm thinking of like Ibrahim Kourosh, when his vocal cords were cut out of his throat. They were obviously perpetrated by the Assad's regime. And my question is, how would he be tried for these offenses, and would he only be tried for like violations of international law, and would he have to go to multiple trials?
So
it's like a long question. I'm just very
No,
curious.
it's okay. It's a great question for this panel. Is the book available for pre-order yet on Amazon?
Yeah.
So watch Amazon, because David's book on the International Criminal Court is coming out later this year or early next. I don't want to put too much pressure on him. This, so it's very important that you get the book, and we now have a preview for the book talk.
Well, I mean, the instrument that has been established that was supposed to be a standing body ready to do this kind of trial is, of course, the International Criminal Court. Before the International Criminal Court, there were ad hoc tribunals set up for, say, the former Yugoslavia or Rwanda. The problem for the ICC right now is the ICC only has jurisdiction if the country is either a member of the ICC, or if the nationals committing the crimes are nationals of a state that has joined the ICC. Since the crimes are being committed in Syria by Syrians, right now there's no jurisdiction for the ICC, absent a Security Council referral, which could create jurisdiction. And so from the ICC standpoint right now, there's nothing they can do. There's nothing they can do. If you had some kind of breakthrough, or if the regime fell, perhaps you'd get a Security Council resolution, or perhaps the new regime, more likely, the new regime would give the ICC jurisdiction, which they could do. That would probably be the likely path. I actually think it's very unlikely that you'd have an ICC trial, though, and I think Libya is an example of what is more likely to happen, which is that if the regime were to fall, Assad would probably be hunted down, and the trial would be by 45 millimeter rather than a court. And so I think that's probably the more likely outcome, or perhaps you'd have a national trial. I think it's ultimately unlikely the ICC would get him.
But I think this also raises the issue of why this is such a difficult situation, this civil war. If you're President Assad and you know that your only chance of staying alive is to, prevail in this conflict, and that you don't really have other good paths forward, unless, perhaps you were able to go live somewhere else and, live out peacefully. It makes the incentives very difficult to move toward a diplomatic solution. And as I said before, we talk about how there's no military solution to this conflict, and this may be one of those cases where there's no political solution either, tragically. Ben was talking before about least bad options. It's one of the biggest challenges when you're a foreign policy decision maker. If you're in the situation President Obama is in, he's got a lot of bad options, and he may end up with the least bad, but that still ain't good. I want to say, as I always am so proud that we have both smart faculty and smart students. So I want to just thank everyone for being here, and a special thanks goes to the SIS team for putting this together on very short notice, and I hope that we can continue to do things like that, taking advantage of not only our outstanding faculty, but also our outstanding students. So thank you all very much. Now we can check and see if anything happened in the last hour.
Happened with the French. Thank you for participating.